Today is almost a nostalgic day. And the reason why I say almost is because tomorrow evening, about a little over 180 years ago, the first glimmerings of spiritualism occurred. And I'm going to draw this from Emma Hardinge's Modern American Spiritualism, a 20 years record of the communion between earth and the world of spirits. Now, Emma was a friend of, let me see, Kate, that's okay, Kate and Margaret and Leah Fox. She was friends with all three of them. So she got the story from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And she tells us, and this is a little bit of my own notes mixed in that, is that in many accountings of the wrappings, little is known about them. They're not talking about the wrappings themselves. Okay, we sometimes assume that such events occur spontaneously. But in this instance, the wrappings from Mr. Rosema, who had been killed a year prior to that, had been wrapping that whole time. There was at least one family that I can recall that lived there before the Foxes did, but I think there were two. And the reason the families moved out was because of the wrappings. The first one moved out because they were the ones responsible, but the second one moved out because of the wrappings. And so the Fox family had been experiencing these wrappings for a few weeks, maybe off and on from the time they moved in. I don't know when they moved in, but on this particular evening, Friday evening, March 31st, 1884, those disturbances that the Fox family had been experiencing came to a climax. And Kate, who was the youngest, she was 12 at the time, was the first to move through that frightening experience and then found it amusing. Kids are so wonderful, aren't they? You know, an adult would just, and that actually happened with a lot of the adults. But anyway, I'm getting away from this. And she realized that the wrappings that they were hearing were in response to her father going around to the windows, rattling them and everything, trying to get it to stop. Because one of the explanations they presented was that the winds were rattling the windows. However, there was probably very little wind at the time. I don't know. But anyway, he was rattling the window sashes in an attempt to silence them. And it was then that she said, and I guess she was the one who named the spirit that was rattling everything, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do. And she began snapping her fingers. And every time she snapped her fingers, there was a rap. And even when she pretended to snap her fingers, there was still a rap. So the wrappings were being presented by some source of intelligence. And I don't have it included here, but I have it in some other notes that the next morning, Andrew Jackson Davis, who was some hundreds of miles away, had wrote in his journal a message that he had received from Spirit, which was along these lines: "Oh, brother, the movement has begun." So Does anybody have any comments or questions? We may touch on more of this as we go through.
I just find that history really interesting. I'd like to know more about it.
Okay, all we gotta do is ask questions. Because I just run through things, you know, and I've gotten bored with the history because I had been reading the history for almost 3 years. And they're all pretty much starting to sound the same.
Just recommend one.
So
And I'll go with the book.
if there was one for me to recommend, well, let me get to the right point here. All right. It would be Leah Underhill's Missing Link in Modern Spiritualism. And the only reason I recommend that is that she's one of the Fox sisters. And then second would be Emma Hardinge's, get back to it here, Emma Hardinge's Modern American Spiritualism, a 20 years record. Those are the two I would strongly recommend as far as history goes. Now, some people like Arthur Conan Doyle's A History of Spiritualism.
Oh, he's a Brit. I'm American.
Well, if you want American, then I would not recommend Emma Hardinge. She's a Brit too, as you put it.
She was a friend of the Fox sisters?
Yes.
She didn't live here?
She was, when she came here to visit, she was here for several years
Okay.
before returning. So. See, Emma was originally an opera singer.
No kidding.
Yes.
How interesting is that?
And when she came to the United States to visit, the people she would, no, not to visit, to perform, the people she was staying with took her to a seance. And indirectly, her mediumship was sparked, because she sat in several seances before she herself began doing message work and doing seances. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that our interpretation of a seance is not the same as what their interpretation of a seance was. Because with the Fox sisters, with that event, that was the first public seance. The first time an event like that where the general public was involved. Because before that time, seances were something that took place, or a version. I don't recall what they would have been called at the time, but spirit communication has always been taking place. Emanuel Swedenborg was clairvoyant. Nostradamus was clairvoyant. And so were many others throughout history. What's her Joan of Arc? Joan of Arcadia was clairvoyant. These are all examples of spirit communication. And these communications have been happening throughout our existence. Do you remember my telling you about Hermes and his experience, where he saw this ball of light in one of his meditations, and it communicated with him, and then it reformed into a dragon, and it communicated with him. Jesus, when Jesus asked his disciples, or a handful of his disciples, I think it was Peter, John, maybe one other, to sit with him in the garden while he prayed. And they awoke and they saw him with Elijah and Moses. Spirit communication. Peter, after the death of Jesus in Acts, was on the roof of someone's house that they were staying at after their journey from wherever they were at beforehand. And a tapestry appeared before him with all these animals and everything. And an angel had said, pick one to eat, because he was hungry. And he held fast to his beliefs. See, this stuff has been happening. The oracles of Delphi, this stuff has been happening, but not in public, always in private. The early Christians would gather in homes, and sometimes the Spirit would speak through a prophet and teach, because they were called teachers. Just what we do on the fourth Sunday. They were doing it a couple thousand years ago. So there's a long history. The development of spiritualism, is centers on this one event, public seances. And after that is when the spiritualist churches started doing message work. And not only that, but they also began channeling through trance mediumship, spirit teachings. And now I'm getting too far. Let me see here now. Now, when Emma Hardinge came to the United States, she came here to perform. And as she was doing this in the evenings, during the afternoons, she would visit these other places. Her friends would take her to these spiritualists that were developing. And she would get these messages and such. And then, for whatever reason, it triggered something within her. See, the training of mediums at that time was not more of a direct approach as we do it today. It was passive. It was latent. And people, by attending these seances, these circles and such, I can only imagine that they would develop a curiosity, and this curiosity would do a couple of things. One, it would open them up, and two, it would inspire them in much the same way as when we started our spirit channeling sessions here in that November that we started, when I said, well, let's try something different. So a lot of them would just seem to develop spontaneously, but the interest was there. And the thing to keep in mind is they didn't have TV like we have now. They didn't have the squawk box to distract us. They were left reading or listening to music, and listening to music, you can read while you're listening to music, because we all do it. So they were probably doing it as well. You visit with friends and everything. There was more of a reason to be outgoing than to stay home. And so because they were outgoing, they would this curiosity within them would develop. And I can only assume that it was this curiosity that allowed them to develop the mediumship traits. And that happened with Emma Hardinge. And so she fulfilled her contract, and she began exploring her mediumship. And so she goes to this printing warehouse. I forget who it was, but anyway, they had a sign in the window that they had rooms available, offices or whatever you want to call it, available. So she rents one, and she discovers that the room she is renting is right next to one of the Fox sisters. And that's how they became friends. I forget which one. I don't know if it was Kate or Margaret. I know it wasn't Leah. But Leah was having circles herself because, well, let me see here. You know, we had the wrappings at Hydesville, and through those wrappings, you know, they were forced to move. So they moved into Rochester, and people began visiting them for messages and such, what they called seances. People began visiting them, and through these seances, the spirits began telling them that they needed to do a public display. And what's the first thing that comes to mind? If I'm asking you to do something publicly, oh crap, not me. No, no, no. And they were no different. They were no different. It took them a year before they gave in. And the souls kept nagging them and nagging them. And during that year, you know, they were complaining. For months, they were complaining. Oh, man, I'm tired of this. Leave us alone. Stop, stop, stop. And you know what happened? They stopped. And someone came calling on them with a friend and said, you know, I brought a friend and we'd like a demonstration if you don't mind. And I don't recall which one had answered the door. I think it was Leah. And she said, I'm sorry, but they don't speak to us anymore. And the guy said, what do you mean they don't speak? They don't. They've left. They've left, and we're better for it. And, okay, well then, you know, let's see if we can attract the spirits. So he and his friend went back home, and wouldn't you know, mediumship started spreading. But that's an altogether different story there. Back to the Fox sisters, because it was the Fox sisters and their mother. Their father was elsewhere managing, I don't know. He seems to drop out of the picture after the wrappings in Hydesville. So anyway, and you know, it was quiet. It was silent. They couldn't hear them anymore, harassing them. And you know what happened? The same thing that happens to all of us when we become accustomed to certain events or with certain people. They began to become lonely. So what do? All right, come back. We like your advice and everything. Come back. And so the spirits showed back up and they said, okay, so what do you think about our proposal? We'll think about it. So getting back to the story here, you know, so they finally gave in to spirit. And spirits, the spirits they were communicating with, gave them instructions on how to go about this presentation. They were to make stops along the way from Rochester to New York City. I think it was New York City, because if I recall correctly, they traveled through Auburn. There's an Auburn in New York, yes? Okay. So one of these people, there were 4 people there. One was to introduce them, give a lecture and everything. The other one was supposed to manage the building and collecting. They were to charge a quarter. I guess maybe a quarter was a big deal then, I don't know. But anyway, they were to charge for it. And I don't recall what the other one did. I do know that, people assume that it was Kate and Margaret that were in Corinthian Hall. That's it. This was when they were examined, Corinthian Hall. So anyway, people assume, at least I did, because that's where my training came from, that the sisters that were examined were Kate and Margaret, but that was not the case. The sisters that were examined were Leah and Margaret, because Kate, being the youngest, she would have been 13, was with her mother. And I think they were with, oh gosh, the name was there, and then it went. Well, I'm not going to rack my brain trying to remember it. I'm not going to go through this to see if I can find it. But I can tell you that they were abolitionists, and they were friends. If they weren't friends of Leah's, then they had received one of the pamphlets that Dusler had printed up, because Mr. Dusler was one of those in attendance at the knockings in Hydesville. And he was actually the one who came up with a system to actually make sense of what was taking place. 2 raps for yes, 1 for no. Rap on the letters as he went through the alphabet. He was the one who discovered that the spirit was Mr. Rosen. He was the one who discovered what had happened, that he was a peddler who had stopped at that particular home the year prior, and was killed for the money he had that he was taking home to his family. So a lot of stuff going on there. And incidentally, when they dug up the basement later in that summer, okay, they didn't find anything. But there was another location that they dug up, that they were guided towards, and they found potential evidence of the crime. We found some hair and some lime, and I think a little bit of bone, but I'm not sure. But anyway, that's how all of this started. And at Corinthian Hall in I want to say November of 1850, could be wrong, but they were examined by reputable, upstanding people, much like the same reputable, upstanding citizens that we have today. And for 3 nights, they were examined, they were tested. And for 3 nights, the committees that were selected came back and said that we could not find any way that they were acting fraudulently. This is real. And you know what the crowd had to say? Oh, it's not real. There's something wrong with you people. Impossible. It doesn't work that way. It can't work that way. We haven't had anything like this since the beginning of Christianity. It can't happen that way. But it did. And some of the ministers that were there were convinced of it. In fact, I don't know if it was at the wrappings or at Corinthian Hall, but I think it was Reverend Irwin. I could be wrong on that. But anyway, he was a Quaker. And 5 years prior to that, the Quakers had a visitation from the Indians. I shouldn't say Indians. I think the proper term now is Native Americans. From the natives. The souls of the natives visited them and put them in a panic because they would slip into these bodies, do stuff and slip out. And you know what's the natural thing? The devil. So eventually spiritualism split off into two different aspects. You've got the one aspect that focused on the phenomena, which is what the Fox sisters promoted. That was the only part of spiritualism they were actively involved in, doing the readings, doing the seances and such. In fact, they were expelled from their church. And then you have the other group, you know, these people who were there for the phenomena were called spiritists because they were only interested in the phenomena. And then there were the other group that was interested in all these other teachings and everything. What's going on the other side? What can I do here? What are the real rules and everything? The more philosophical, inquisitive approach. They were called modern spiritualists. And the one who gave the lecture before each of the examinations was the one who helped form that aspect of it. So now you have a general understanding of you know how all of that took place.